The sun was setting behind the rocky hills when Jake Morrison found something that would change his life forever. He was a poor rancher who owned a small piece of land in the desert of Arizona. His cattle were thin, his fences were broken, and his bank account was nearly empty. Every day was a struggle just to keep his ranch running. Jake had been tracking one of his lost cows for 3 hours. The animal had wandered off during the morning, and now he was deep in the canyon country, where few people ever went. The ground was rough and covered with sharp rocks that made his old horse stumble with each step. His water bottle was almost empty, and the heat was making him dizzy. As he rode along the bottom of a narrow canyon, something caught his eye. There was a dark opening in the rock wall that looked like a cave. Jake had lived in this area for 15 years, but he had never noticed this cave before. It was hidden behind some thick bushes and large boulders. His lost cow was nowhere to be seen, but something about the cave made him curious. Jake tied his horse to a dead tree and pushed through the thorny bushes. The opening was bigger than it first appeared. Cool air flowed out from the darkness, which felt good after the hot desert sun. He pulled out his flashlight and stepped inside. The cave went back much deeper than he expected. The walls were smooth, and the floor was covered with sand. As he walked further into the darkness, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of chains rattling, followed by a low moan that echoed off the cave walls. Jake stopped walking and listened carefully. The sound came again, definitely human but filled with pain and exhaustion. His hand shook as he pointed his flashlight toward the back of the cave. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. 2 women were sitting on the ground, chained to the cave wall by thick metal shackles around their ankles. They were both very tall and strong-looking, but their faces showed the effects of being trapped for a long time. Their clothes were torn and dirty, and they squinted in the bright light of his flashlight. When they saw Jake, they tried to move, backward, fear filling their dark eyes. The women looked like they were sisters. They had the same high cheekbones, the same long black hair, and the same bronze skin that marked them as Native American. Jake guessed they were Apache, based on their appearance and the traditional jewelry they still wore around their necks. "Please don't hurt us," one of the women whispered in English with a thick accent. Her voice was hoarse from thirst and fear. Jake lowered his flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "My name is Jake. Who did this to you? How long have you been here?" The other sister spoke up, her voice stronger despite her condition. "We have been here for many days. Bad men brought us here. They said they would come back, but that was a long time ago." Jake's mind raced as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Someone had kidnapped these women and chained them in this remote cave. They had been left here to die with no food or water. It was a miracle they were still alive. He knelt down next to them and examined the chains. They were thick and heavy, secured with large padlocks. There was no way to break them without proper tools. The women's ankles were raw and bleeding where the metal had rubbed against their skin. "What are your names?" Jake asked as he gave them water from his bottle. "I am Maria," said the first sister. "This is my sister Rosa. We work at the reservation school, teaching children. We were driving home one night when men in masks stopped our car." Rosa nodded weakly. "They brought us here and said someone would pay money for us, but no one came. We thought we would die in this place." Jake felt anger rising in his chest. Human trafficking was something he had heard about on the news, but he never imagined it could happen so close to his home. These women had been treated like animals, left to suffer in the darkness. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jake promised. "But I need to go back to my ranch to get tools to cut these chains. Can you hold on a little longer?" Both sisters nodded, hope returning to their eyes for the first time in weeks. As Jake rode back to his ranch in the growing darkness, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had discovered. He knew he should call the police, but something held him back. The sisters had mentioned that bad men had kidnapped them. In this part of Arizona, that usually meant one thing: the Valdez cartel. The Valdez family controlled most of the illegal activities in the area. They smuggled drugs, weapons, and people across the border from Mexico. Local law enforcement was either too scared or too corrupt to stop them. If Jake called the police, word might get back to the cartel that their prisoners had been found. By Kerr. The time Jake reached his ranch, he had made a decision that would put his own life in danger. He was going to rescue Maria and Rosa himself, without involving the authorities. He didn't know it yet, but this choice would start a chain of events that would lead to violence and death. Jake gathered bolt cutters, food, water, and blankets. He also loaded his rifle, something he hadn't touched in years. As he prepared for the rescue, he thought about the two sisters waiting in the dark cave, counting on him to save their lives. The poor rancher had stumbled upon something much bigger and more dangerous than a lost cow. He had found two lives that needed saving, and he was the only person who could help them. But in a few hours, when he cut those chains and set the sisters free, he would unknowingly declare war on one of the most violent criminal organizations in the Southwest. Jake returned to the cave just before midnight, carrying a heavy backpack filled with supplies. The desert was cold and quiet, with only the sound of his boots on the rocky ground. He had left his horse tied far away from the cave entrance to avoid making noise that might attract unwanted attention. The sisters were still awake when he arrived, their eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight like frightened animals. They had been talking quietly to each other in Apache, probably wondering if the strange rancher would really come back to help them. "I told you I would return," Jake whispered as he knelt beside them with the bolt cutters. The chains were harder to cut than he had expected. The metal was thick and the bolt cutters were old, but after 20 minutes of hard work, he managed to break through the first shackle. Maria rubbed her ankle where the metal had been, tears of relief running down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "We thought we would never see the sky again." Rosa's chains took even longer to cut, because the metal was positioned at an awkward angle against the cave wall. Jake's hands were cramped and bleeding by the time he cut through the second shackle, but seeing both sisters free made all the pain worth it. The women tried to stand but immediately fell down. Their legs were weak from being chained in one position for so long. Jake helped them slowly get to their feet and gave them food and water while they regained their strength. "How long were you trapped here?" Jake asked as he wrapped blankets around their shoulders. 12 days, Rosa answered. "Maybe 13. It was hard to count without seeing the sun." As they prepared to leave the cave, Maria grabbed Jake's arm. "You don't understand what you've done," she said, her voice filled with worry. "The men who took us work for Carlos Valdez. When he finds out we're gone, he will come looking for us. You will be in great danger." Jake had suspected the Valdez cartel was involved, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach turn. Carlos Valdez was known throughout Arizona as a man who showed no mercy to anyone who interfered with his business. People who crossed him had a habit of disappearing forever. "We can't leave you here to die," Jake said firmly. "Whatever happens next, we'll deal with it." The journey back to Jake's ranch took over an hour because the sisters were still weak and had to rest frequently. Every shadow seemed to hide potential enemies, and every sound made Jake reach for his rifle. He knew that rescuing Maria and Rosa was just the beginning of his troubles. When they finally reached the small ranch house, Jake helped the sisters inside and gave them clean clothes and hot soup. While they cleaned themselves up and rested, he stood at the window watching the dirt road that led to his property. He half expected to see headlights coming through the darkness at any moment. Maria and Rosa were both school teachers at the San Carlos Apache Reservation, about 50 miles north of Jake's ranch. They had been driving home from a meeting in town when 3 men in masks had forced their car off the road. The sisters had been blindfolded and driven to the cave where their captors had chained them up and left them to wait for buyers who never came. "We heard them talking," Rosa explained as she sat at Jake's kitchen table. "They said they were going to sell us to men in Mexico who pay high prices for Apache women. They think we have special powers because of our heritage." Jake felt sick, thinking about what would have happened if he hadn't found them. Human trafficking was big business for the cartels, and Native American women were particularly valuable because some people believed in old superstitions about their supposed mystical abilities. As dawn approached, Jake faced a difficult decision. The logical thing to do would be to drive the sisters to the nearest police station and let the authorities handle the situation. But Jake knew that several local police officers were on the Valdez payroll. If word got back to Carlos that his prisoners had been rescued, the cartel leader would stop at nothing to find them again. "There's another problem," Maria said quietly. "Our father is Thomas Crow Feather. He's the chairman of our tribal council. When he finds out what happened to us, he will want revenge against the men who took us." Jake's blood ran cold. Thomas Crow Feather was a respected leader, but he was also known for his fierce temper and his refusal to let anyone harm his people. If he learned that his daughters had been kidnapped and nearly sold into slavery, he might declare war on the Valdez cartel. "You need to call your father," Jake said. "Tell him you're safe, but ask him to be careful about what he does next." Rosa shook her head. "You don't know our father. When someone hurts his family, he doesn't think about being careful. He thinks about justice." As the sun rose over the desert, Jake realized he had walked into the middle of a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. On one side was Carlos Valdez, a ruthless criminal who would kill anyone who interfered with his business. On the other side was Thomas Crow Feather, a proud Apache leader who would never forgive the people who had kidnapped his daughters. Jake was just a poor rancher who had stumbled into something much bigger than himself. All he had wanted was to find his lost cow and go home. Instead, he had rescued 2 women and started a chain of events that could lead to bloodshed throughout the region. The sisters used Jake's phone to call their father. Even though they spoke in Apache, Jake could hear the anger in Thomas Crow Feather's voice when he learned what had happened to his daughters. The conversation lasted for almost an hour, with Maria and Rosa taking turns trying to calm their father down. When they finally hung up, both women looked worried. "What did he say?" Jake asked. "He's coming here with some of our warriors," Rosa answered. "He wants to meet the man who saved his daughters, but he also wants to know everything about the people who took us." Jake poured himself a cup of coffee with shaking hands. In a few hours, his quiet ranch would become a meeting place for Apache warriors who were planning their response to the kidnapping. Meanwhile, somewhere in the desert, Carlos Valdez was probably discovering that his prisoners had escaped. The poor rancher had thought he was simply doing the right thing by rescuing 2 innocent women. He had no idea that his act of kindness would soon ignite a war between 2 powerful groups that had been enemies for generations. Thomas Crow Feather arrived at Jake's ranch just after noon, and he didn't come alone. 6 pickup trucks filled with Apache warriors followed him down the dusty road, kicking up clouds of desert sand. Jake watched from his front porch as the vehicles parked in a semicircle around his small house. The tribal chairman was a tall, powerful man in his 60s with long gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with modern pieces, a leather vest over a white shirt, jeans, and boots decorated with silver. When he stepped out of his truck, the other warriors remained in their vehicles waiting for his signal. Maria and Rosa ran to their father and hugged him tightly. Jake could see tears in the old man's eyes as he held his daughters, but his face remained stern and controlled. After a long moment, Thomas looked up at Jake and walked slowly toward the porch. "You are the man who saved my daughters," Thomas said in perfect English, his voice deep and measured. "I just did what anyone would do," Jake replied, suddenly feeling nervous under the intense gaze of the Apache leader. Thomas studied Jake for a long moment, then nodded with approval. "Not everyone would risk their life for strangers. You have shown great courage. The Apache people will not forget this." But as Thomas spoke, Jake could see the anger burning behind his calm exterior. This was a man who had spent his entire life protecting his people, and someone had dared to kidnap his own daughters. The insult was too great to ignore. "Tell me about the men who took them," Thomas said, his voice growing harder. Jake described everything he knew about the cave and the kidnapping, while Maria and Rosa added details about their captors. When they mentioned Carlos Valdez, Thomas's expression darkened even more. "The Valdez family has been poison in this land for too long," Thomas said. "They sell drugs to our young people and steal our women for their evil business. This cannot continue." One of the Apache warriors, a younger man with scars on his arms, got out of his truck and approached them. "Father," he said to Thomas, "our scouts have found the cave where the sisters were held. There are tire tracks and footprints We can follow them. Jake realized this was one of Thomas's sons, probably Maria and Rosa's brother. The family resemblance was strong, and the young man had the same fierce look in his eyes as his father. "This is my son, David," Thomas explained. "He served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Army Rangers. He knows how to track enemies." David nodded at Jake with respect. "Thank you for saving my sisters. Now we need to make sure the people who took them can never hurt anyone else." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He could see where this was heading, and it wasn't going to end peacefully. "Maybe we should call the FBI," he suggested. "Human trafficking is a federal crime. Let the authorities handle this." Thomas shook his head firmly. "The authorities have failed to stop the Valdez cartel for 20 years. They are either too weak or too corrupt to act. But Apache justice is swift and certain." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Carlos Valdez chose that moment to make his presence known. The sound of approaching vehicles came from the east, and Jake saw a convoy of black SUVs racing toward his ranch. There were at least 8 vehicles, each filled with armed men. "Get inside," Thomas ordered his daughters. "David, tell our warriors to take defensive positions." Jake grabbed his rifle. From inside the house, his hands shaking as he realized his worst fears were coming true. The cartel had tracked Maria and Rosa to his ranch, and now both sides were armed and ready for a fight. The black SUVs stopped about 100 yards from the house, just out of rifle range. Car doors slammed shut, and Jake counted at least 30 men spreading out in a line. They all carried automatic weapons and wore body armor, looking like a small army. A man in an expensive suit walked forward from the group, stopping halfway between the two forces. Even from a distance, Jake could see the confidence and arrogance in his posture. This had to be Carlos Valdez himself. "Thomas Crowfeather," Carlos called out in a voice that carried across the desert. "You have something that belongs to me. Return my property, and no one needs to get hurt." Thomas stepped forward, his warriors flanking him on both sides. "Your property?" he shouted back. "You speak of my daughters as if they were cattle. They are free Apache women, and they will never be your slaves." Carlos laughed, a cold sound that made Jake's skin crawl. "Everything in this desert belongs to me, old man. I take what I want and I sell what I please. Your daughters will bring me $50,000 each in the Mexico markets." "Then you will die trying to collect," Thomas replied, his hand moving to the pistol on his belt. Jake found himself caught in the middle of a confrontation that had been building for years. The Valdez cartel represented everything that was evil about the modern world: greed, violence, and the treatment of human beings as merchandise. Thomas and his warriors represented an older code of justice, one that demanded blood for blood and honor above all else. Both sides began moving into better positions, using Jake's ranch buildings and equipment as cover. The Apache warriors were outnumbered, but they had experience and the advantage of defending familiar ground. The cartel members had superior weapons and armor, but they were in hostile territory. Jake realized that his small ranch was about to become a battlefield. The rescue of 2 innocent women had sparked a conflict that could result in dozens of deaths. He thought about trying to negotiate peace between the two sides, but he could see that both Thomas and Carlos were beyond the point of compromise. Carlos made one final attempt to avoid bloodshed, but his words only made things worse. "I'll give you one last chance, Crowfeather. Give me the women and the rancher who stole them, and I'll let the rest of you live." Thomas's response was to draw his pistol and fire a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed across the desert like thunder, and Jake knew there would be no turning back. "Apache warriors do not negotiate with kidnappers," Thomas declared. "You want our women? Come and take them." The poor rancher, who had only wanted to help 2 kidnapped women, watched in horror as both sides prepared for a battle that would change the desert forever. In trying to save Maria and Rosa, he had ignited a war between 2 worlds that could never coexist peacefully. The first shot came from Carlos Valdez's men just as the sun reached its highest point in the sky. A sniper hidden behind one of the SUVs tried to take out Thomas, but the bullet struck the wooden post of Jake's porch instead. The sound of splintering wood was immediately followed by the crack of return fire from the Apache warriors. Jake dove behind his water trough as bullets began flying in both directions. The quiet desert morning had suddenly turned into a war zone, with his small ranch house at the center of the battlefield. He could hear Maria and Rosa crying inside the house, trapped between two forces that seemed determined to destroy each other. David Crow Feather proved that his military training was still sharp. He had positioned his warriors in a defensive line using Jake's outbuildings and farm equipment as cover. The Apache fighters were calm and disciplined, making every shot count while the cartel members sprayed bullets wildly in all directions. "Stay down, rancher," David called out to Jake. "This is our fight now." But Jake couldn't just hide while a battle raged on his property. These were his neighbors and friends who were risking their lives. He crawled toward the house, staying low as bullets whizzed overhead, and managed to reach the front door. Inside, he found Thomas standing at the living room window with a rifle, calmly picking targets among the cartel forces. The old Apache leader showed no fear, even though he was outnumbered and outgunned. "You should have stayed out of this," Thomas said without looking away from the window. "Now you're part of the war whether you want to be or not." Jake positioned himself at another window and started shooting back at the cartel members. He wasn't a soldier like David, but he had been hunting in these hills for years and knew how to use a rifle. Every time he fired, he aimed carefully and made the shot count. The battle lasted for over an hour, with both sides trading fire across the desert landscape. The cartel had more men and better weapons, but the Apache warriors had better positions and superior marksmanship skills. Several of Carlos's men went down, while the defenders remained mostly unharmed. Carlos himself stayed behind the safety of his armored SUV, shouting orders at his men through a radio. Jake could see the cartel leader's frustration growing as his supposedly easy victory turned into a costly battle. "Bring up the heavy weapons," Carlos screamed into his radio. "I want that house destroyed and everyone in it dead." Two of the cartel members ran back to their vehicles and returned with rocket-propelled grenades. Jake's heart sank as he realized they were about to face weapons that could destroy his entire ranch in minutes. "Everyone out of the house now," Thomas ordered. "We need to spread out before they turn this place into rubble." Jake, Thomas, Maria, and Rosa ran from the house just as the first RPG struck the building. The explosion was deafening, and chunks of wood and stone flew in all directions. Jake's home, where he had lived for 15 years, disappeared in a cloud of smoke and flame. The Apache warriors had already moved to new positions around the property, using Jake's barn, tool shed, and old truck as cover. They continued firing at the cartel members, but Jake could see they were slowly being pushed back by superior firepower. David appeared beside his father and Jake, breathing heavily from running between positions. "We can't hold them much longer," he reported. "We're running out of ammunition and they have us surrounded on 3 sides. "Then we make our stand here," Thomas replied grimly. "Better to die fighting than to let them take our women." Jake looked around at the destruction of his ranch and the brave people who were about to die defending it. This wasn't how he had imagined his life would end when he woke up that morning. But seeing the courage of the Apache warriors and the determination of Thomas to protect his daughters, Jake knew he had made the right choice in rescuing Maria and Rosa. Suddenly, a new sound filled the air, the whine of helicopter rotors approaching from the north. Jake looked up and saw 3 military helicopters flying toward them at high speed. For a moment, he thought Carlos had called in air support, but then he saw the markings on the aircraft. "FBI," David said with amazement. Someone called in the federal agents. The helicopters landed behind the cartel positions, and dozens of federal agents in tactical gear poured out. Through megaphones, they ordered both sides to lay down their weapons and surrender. Carlos Valdez found himself trapped between the Apache warriors and the FBI. His men began throwing down their guns and raising their hands, but Carlos himself tried to run. He sprinted toward one of his SUVs, but David Crow Feather was faster. The young Apache warrior tackled Carlos before he could reach his vehicle, and the 2 men rolled across the desert sand in a brutal fight. David had youth and training on his side, but Carlos fought like a desperate animal. The cartel leader pulled a knife and slashed at David, cutting him across the arm before Thomas appeared and knocked Carlos unconscious with the butt of his drill. As FBI agents swarmed over the scene, arresting cartel members and securing weapons, Jake surveyed the ruins of his ranch. His house was destroyed. His barn was full of bullet holes and his truck was turned over on its side. Everything he had worked for his entire life was gone. But when he looked at Maria and Rosa, still alive and safe despite everything that had happened, Jake knew the cost had been worth it. The two Apache sisters were free, and Carlos Valdez would never hurt anyone again. Special Agent Sarah Martinez, who seemed to be in charge of the FBI team, approached Jake and Thomas. "We've been tracking the Valdez cartel for 2 years," she explained. "When our surveillance picked up radio chatter about a battle in the desert, we knew Carlos had finally made a mistake big enough to bring him down." Thomas handed over his rifle without being asked. "My daughters were kidnapped and nearly sold into slavery," he said with dignity. "We came here to bring them home safely." Agent Martinez nodded with understanding. "We know what happened, Mr. Crowfeather. You won't be charged with any crimes. You were defending your family against kidnappers and human traffickers." Jake felt relief wash over him as he realized the nightmare was finally over. The FBI had arrived just in time to prevent a massacre, and justice would be served through the legal system rather than through bloodshed. As the sun began to set over the desert, Jake stood in the ruins of his ranch and watched as Carlos Valdez was loaded into a helicopter in handcuffs. The cartel leader who had terrorized the region for years was finally going to face justice for his crimes. The poor rancher had lost everything he owned, but he had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he had done the right thing when it mattered most. 3 weeks after the battle at Jake's ranch, the courtroom in Phoenix was packed with reporters, federal agents, and members of the Apache community. Carlos Valdez sat at the defendant's table in an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands cuffed and his arrogant demeanor replaced by the defeated look of a man who knew his empire had crumbled. Jake sat in the gallery wearing his only good suit, which he had borrowed from a neighbor. The FBI had asked him to testify about finding Maria and Rosa in the cave, and he was nervous about speaking in front of so many people. He had never been comfortable with attention, and the media coverage of the ranch battle had made him famous. Throughout Arizona, Thomas Crowfeather sat nearby with his daughters and son, all dressed in traditional Apache clothing to honor the significance of the day. The tribal chairman had become something of a folk hero after the story spread about how he had defended his family against kidnappers. People across the country were calling him a symbol of justice and parental love. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named District Attorney Rebecca Stone, had built an overwhelming case against Carlos and his organization. The evidence included the cave where Maria and Rosa had been held, financial records showing payments for human trafficking, and testimony from dozens of victims who had finally found the courage to speak. "Your Honor," D.A. Stone said as she addressed the judge, "Carlos Valdez operated the largest human trafficking ring in the southwestern United States. His organization kidnapped, enslaved, and sold over 200 women and children over the past 5 years. The defendant showed no mercy to his victims, and he deserves none from this court." Carlos's expensive defense lawyer tried to argue that his client was just a businessman who had made some poor choices, but the evidence against the cartel leader was too strong to overcome. Video surveillance, wiretapped phone calls, and financial records painted a clear picture of a criminal enterprise that had destroyed countless lives. When Jake was called to testify, he walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs. The courtroom was completely silent as he described finding the two Apache women chained in the cave like animals. They had been there for almost 2 weeks without food or water. Jake said into the microphone, his voice breaking with emotion. They thought they were going to die in that dark place forgotten by the world. No human being should ever be treated that way. Maria and Rosa also testified about their ordeal, describing in detail how Carlos's men had kidnapped them and planned to sell them to buyers in Mexico. Their words were powerful and heartbreaking, bringing tears to the eyes of everyone in the courtroom. "He looked at us like we were cattle," Maria said, pointing directly at Carlos. "He told us we were valuable because we were Apache women, as if our heritage made us exotic merchandise for his sick customers." The defense tried to claim that Carlos had not personally been involved in the kidnapping, but phone records proved that he had given direct orders to his men about holding the sisters until buyers could be found. There was also evidence that He had planned to expand his operation to target more Native American women from reservations across the Southwest. During the trial, more details emerged about the scope of Carlos's criminal empire. The FBI had discovered warehouses full of drugs, weapons, and evidence of human trafficking operations that stretched from Mexico to Canada. They had also found financial records showing that Carlos had been paying bribes to local police officers and border guards. The most shocking revelation came when investigators found a ledger book that listed the names and prices of over 300 women and children who had been sold through Carlos's network. Each entry showed a person's name, age, ethnicity, and the price they had brought at auction. The book read like a catalog of human misery. Judge Harrison, a stern man with 30 years of experience on the federal bench, listened to all the evidence with a grave expression. When it came time for sentencing, he spoke directly to Carlos, before announcing his decision. "Mr. Valdez, you have operated one of the most evil criminal enterprises this court has ever encountered. You have stolen the freedom and dignity of hundreds of innocent people, treating them as property to be bought and sold. The harm you have caused to your victims and their families cannot be measured in dollars or years." Carlos was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on federal charges of human trafficking, kidnapping, racketeering, and murder. 17 members of his organization received sentences ranging from 25 years to life. The Valdez cartel, which had terrorized the region for decades, was finally destroyed. After the sentencing, Jake found himself surrounded by reporters who wanted to interview the hero rancher who had started the investigation that brought down the cartel. He tried to avoid the cameras and microphones, but one reporter managed to corner him outside the courthouse. "Mr. Morrison, how does it feel to know that your actions saved hundreds of lives?" the reporter asked. Jake thought for a moment before answering. "I didn't set out to be a hero," he said quietly. "I was just looking for a lost cow when I found those women. Any decent person would have done the same thing. But the truth was that most people would have called the police and let someone else handle the problem. Jake had risked his life and lost everything he owned because he couldn't stand by and let innocent people suffer. That kind of courage was rare in the world." Thomas Crow Feather approached Jake as he tried to escape the media crowd. The Apache leader put his hand on Jake's shoulder and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "This man showed more honor and bravery than most people show in a lifetime," Thomas declared. "He saved my daughters when they had no hope left. The Apache people will never forget what he did for our family." The crowd of reporters pressed closer, but Thomas raised his hand for silence. Jake Morrison lost his home and everything he owned because he chose to help strangers in need. That is the true measure of a man's character. As they walked away from the courthouse together, Jake realized that his life had been completely changed by the events of the past few weeks. His ranch was gone, but he had gained something more valuable: the respect of good people and the knowledge that he had made a real difference in the world. The poor rancher who had discovered 2 chained women in a cave had started a chain of events that brought down a criminal empire and saved hundreds of lives. Justice had been served, but the consequences of that discovery would continue to ripple outward for years to come. 6 months after Carlos Valdez was sentenced to life in prison, Jake Morrison stood on a hill overlooking a construction site where workers were building something that had never existed before. The sign at the entrance read, "Morrison Crow Feather, Community Center," and it represented a partnership that had grown from tragedy into hope. After the trial, Jake had found himself homeless and nearly penniless. His ranch was destroyed, his cattle were scattered, and his insurance company was still fighting over whether the damage was covered. At 52 years old, he faced the prospect of starting his life completely over, with nothing but the clothes on his back. That's when Thomas Crow Feather had made an unexpected offer. The Apache Tribal Council wanted to build a community center that would serve both the reservation and the surrounding area. They needed someone to manage the project and run the center once it was completed. The job came with a house, a salary, and the chance to make a real difference in people's lives. "You saved our daughters," Thomas had explained when he offered Jake the position. "Now we want to save you." Jake had accepted gratefully, and the past 6 months had been the most fulfilling. of his life. Working with the Apache community had taught him about a culture and way of life that he had never understood before. He learned about their deep connection to the land, their respect for elders, and their belief that helping others was not just a good deed but a sacred responsibility. The community center was designed to address the very problems that had led to Maria and Rosa's kidnapping. It would provide education programs for young people, job training for adults, and support services for families dealing with poverty and addiction. Most importantly, it would include a safe house for women and children who were victims of trafficking or domestic violence. Maria and Rosa had both taken jobs at the center as counselors and teachers. They used their own experience as kidnapping survivors to help other women who had faced similar trauma. Their courage in sharing their story had inspired dozens of other trafficking victims to come forward and seek help. David Crow Feather had also found a new purpose after the battle at Jake's ranch. He left his job as a security guard and became the center's director of safety and outreach. His military training made him perfect for protecting vulnerable people and coordinating with law enforcement agencies. The center had already made a real difference in the community, even before the building was finished. The FBI had established a permanent office in the area to continue investigating human trafficking cases. Local police departments had received special training on how to recognize and respond to kidnapping situations. Most importantly, people were no longer afraid to report suspicious activities. Jake's role as community center manager had given him a sense of purpose he had never felt as a struggling rancher. Every day brought new challenges and opportunities to help people improve their lives. He had gone from being a man who could barely pay his bills to someone who was making a real difference in the world. The media attention from the Carlos Valdez case had also brought unexpected benefits. Donations poured in from across the country to support the community center project. Hollywood celebrities, business leaders, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Jake's story sent money to help build the facility and fund its programs. 1. Afternoon, as Jake was reviewing construction plans in his temporary office, Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI stopped by for a visit. She had become a friend during the months of investigation and trial preparation. "I have some news I thought you'd want to hear," she said with a smile. "We've used the information from the Valdez case to break up trafficking rings in 6 other states. We've rescued over 100 women and children, and we've arrested more than 50 criminals." Jake felt a warm sense of satisfaction knowing that his decision to rescue Maria and Rosa had led to so many other people being saved. "What about the women who were rescued?" he asked. "Are they getting the help they need?" "That's the best part," Agent Martinez replied. "We're using your community center as a model for programs in other areas. The combination of safe housing, counseling, job training, and cultural support is exactly what these survivors need to rebuild their lives." As they talked, Maria walked into the office carrying a stack of files. She had been working with federal prosecutors to identify other victims of the Valdez organization and help them get the services they needed. "Jake, there's someone here who wants to meet you," she said. "Her name is Elena, and she was rescued from a trafficking ring in California last month. She heard about our center and drove here from Los Angeles." Elena was a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s, with dark hair and nervous eyes that reminded Jake of how Maria and Rosa had looked when he first found them in the cave. She shook his hand tentatively and spoke in accented English. "Agent Martinez told me you were the man who saved the Apache sisters," Elena said. "Because of what you did, the FBI found me and the other girls who were being held by bad men in California. I wanted to thank you for giving me my life back." Jake felt tears in his eyes as he realized the full impact of his actions 6 months ago. When he had cut the chains off Maria and Rosa in that dark cave, he had started a chain reaction that was still saving lives across the country. "You don't need to thank me," Jake said gently. "I'm just glad you're safe now. What are your plans for the future?" Elena smiled for the first time since entering the office. "I want to become a counselor like Maria and Rosa. I want to help other women who have been through what I experienced. Agent Martinez said you might have a job for me at the center." Jake looked at Maria, who nodded enthusiastically. "We can always use more counselors," Maria said, "especially someone who understands what our clients have been through." As Jake offered Elena a position at the community center, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that day when he had been looking for a lost cow. He had lost his ranch and his old way of life, but he had gained something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that one person's courage could change the world. The poor rancher who had discovered two giant Apache sisters chained in a cave had indeed ignited a war, but it was a war against evil that was being won one rescued victim at a time. Thomas Crow Feather had been right when he said that Apache justice was swift and certain. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from violence, but from the simple act of refusing to ignore suffering when you had the power to stop it. As the sun set over the construction site of the new community center, Jake knew that his real life's work was just beginning. There were still people out there who needed rescuing, and he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure they got the help they deserved.